At 7:12 on a Tuesday morning, the HOA president sent a tree crew onto my private lakefront property and ordered them to cut down the trees where bald eagles were nesting. I had warned her in writing. The contractor had warned her too. She ordered them to continue anyway. 48 hours later, the project was shut down, and federal wildlife investigators were asking who authorized it. What Diane Mercer didn't know was that I had the county survey, the original photographs, her written acknowledgement, and a work order carrying 5 words she would eventually have to explain. Proceed. HOA assumes responsibility. If you like watching bullies lose to paperwork and the law, subscribe, because that signature wasn't the worst thing we found. The first saw started at exactly 7:12 that morning. I know the time because I was standing at my kitchen counter when the sound came through the closed windows. Not pruning, not landscaping. A full-size chainsaw running under load. I walked outside and saw 3 trucks parked along the edge of my property. 6 men in orange helmets were already inside my tree line. 1 cottonwood was on the ground. Another had a fresh cut running deep into the trunk. And about 20 feet above the crew was the nest I had photographed 4 days earlier. I didn't run toward the saw. I took out my phone and started recording. "Stop the equipment," I told the foreman. "You're on private property, and there's an eagle nest in those trees." He raised his hand. The saw shut down. Then Diane Mercer stepped out from behind one of the trucks. White jacket, dark sunglasses, black HOA binder under one arm. She didn't look up at the nest. She looked past me toward the lake. "The association authorized this work," she said. "Those trees are obstructing the view corridor." I told her she had already received written notice about the nest. She nodded once. I received it. The foreman looked at her. "Ma'am, I told your office yesterday that we needed wildlife clearance before touching that tree." Diane opened her binder. She pulled out the work order and tapped it with one finger. "You have authorization." The foreman didn't move. So Diane repeated herself, slowly. "The HOA assumes responsibility. Keep cutting." That was the moment I stopped treating this as a disagreement over landscaping. Because Diane had just confirmed 3 things on camera. She knew I objected. She knew about the nest. And she wanted the trees removed anyway. What I didn't know yet was that the foreman had already put his warning in writing. That strip of shoreline had been in my family for 46 years. My father bought the property in 1980. Long before Lake Briar Estates had an HOA, a clubhouse, or rows of 6-bedroom houses facing the water. Back then, there was 1 gravel road and maybe a dozen homes around the lake. By the time I inherited the place, the subdivision next door had grown to 137 houses. My parcel never became part of it. The county deed was clear. So was the survey. My western boundary ran 11 feet beyond the tree line Diane had just sent contractors into. Those trees weren't HOA landscaping. They were mine. I spent 31 years working as a utility lineman. That meant I spent most of my adult life around easements, access agreements, property maps, work orders, and right-of-way disputes. I learned early that an official-looking truck didn't give you permission to stand wherever you wanted. Neither did an HOA binder. My father planted several of those trees after a storm tore through the shoreline in 1987. Over the years, their roots stabilized the bank. Natural growth filled in around them. Eventually, the trees became a windbreak between the house and the development next door. After my wife, Ellen, died, I stopped thinking seriously about selling the place. I wanted quiet. The trees gave me that. Then, 2 summers before the chainsaws arrived, A pair of bald eagles began returning to the tallest cottonwood near the water. I kept my distance. I photographed them from the porch, and I left the trees alone. Diane saw something else. She saw an obstruction. 3 months before the cutting, she came to my gate carrying a 4-page packet. Across the top were the words, Lake Briar Estates View Corridor Improvement Plan. She pointed toward my shoreline. Those trees are costing our homeowners money. According to the packet, 17 lakefront homes were being negatively affected by what the HOA called unmanaged vegetation. My vegetation. On my deed, outside their association. Diane wanted 9 mature trees removed and another 14 trimmed below 30 feet. I asked her one question. What recorded easement gives you authority to do that? She didn't answer. Instead, she showed me a highlighted section of a map labeled Community Aesthetic Impact Area. It looked official. Parcel numbers, boundary lines, HOA letterhead. But there was no recorded easement number anywhere on the page. I told her I would check the county records myself. Her expression changed. You need to understand something, Mark. Your property may not be inside Lake Briar Estates, but what you do affects everyone who invested here. I handed the packet back. Then they should have invested in my property. 2 weeks later, the notices started. One claimed my trees created a shoreline safety concern. Another described them as excessive vegetation. A third warned that the association might pursue corrective action if I refused voluntary compliance. I filed every one. Then Diane made her first major mistake. She copied me on an email chain intended for the HOA's real estate committee. The message listed 7 lakefront homes scheduled for new marketing photographs. At the bottom, Diane had written, "The shoreline obstruction will be resolved before photography day. Premium lake views must remain unobstructed." That email told me the trees were never really about safety. They were about money. And 11 days later, I saw something in the tallest cottonwood that made Diane's deadline much more complicated. The eagles were back. And this time, they were nesting. I noticed the activity early on a Thursday morning. At 6:40, one eagle landed on an upper branch while the second settled into the nest. I took photographs from my porch with a telephoto lens. Then I did what I had done for 31 years around utility incidents. I documented everything: time, date, location, parcel number, and the people who needed to know. At 8:17 that morning, I emailed Diane, the HOA property manager, and the tree company named in one of the previous notices. The message was simple. There is active bald eagle nesting activity in the trees on my property. You do not have permission to enter the parcel or perform tree work. Do not proceed until the site has been properly addressed with the appropriate wildlife authorities. I attached 6 photographs. Diane replied 12 minutes later. One word. Received. I saved the email as a PDF. Then I printed it. 4 days later, a white pickup from the tree company stopped near the boundary. The foreman introduced himself as Carl Jensen. He didn't carry an HOA binder. He carried a rangefinder and a work order. I showed him the survey markers and pointed out the nest from more than 100 feet away. 30 seconds. Carl looked through binoculars for about 30 seconds. Then he lowered them. We're not touching that tree today. Before he left, I watched him write something across the work order. I couldn't read it from where I stood. I assumed the problem was over. It wasn't. The following afternoon, Diane called Carl's supervisor twice. By Monday, the crew had been rescheduled, and at 7:12 Tuesday morning, the first chainsaw started. By the time I reached the shoreline, one cottonwood was already down. The second saw was cutting into the tree that held the nest. I stayed 20 yards back and kept recording. Carl, shut it down. He raised one hand. The saw stopped. For a few seconds, the lake was completely quiet. Then Diane walked toward us from her Lexus. I pointed toward the nest. "You received my email. You know what's up there." "I received your opinion," she said. "No, you received photographs." Carl stepped closer. "Ms. Mercer, I told your office we needed clearance before working around that nest." Diane didn't look at him. She opened her binder and pulled out the work order. "The association accepted responsibility. You were paid to remove the trees." Carl shook his head. "This isn't normal tree work anymore. That should have ended it." Instead, Diane looked at the crew supervisor. "Proceed." I checked the time. 7:26. Then I asked one question for the recording. "Diane, are you personally directing this crew to continue after being warned about the nest?" She looked at me for 2 seconds, then answered, "The HOA assumes responsibility." "Keep cutting." I didn't argue. I photographed the trucks, the company logos, license plates, survey stakes, fresh stumps, and every person standing inside my property line. At 7:41, the tree started to lean. Carl had moved away from the saw. Another crew member finished the cut. 30 seconds later, the cottonwood came down. The impact shook the ground beneath my boots. Branches snapped across the shoreline. The nest disappeared into them. Diane looked through the opening toward the lake. For the first time that morning, she smiled. "See?" she said. "That's what it should have looked like." I said nothing. At 8:03, the crew started packing up. Diane drove away first. Carl waited until her Lexus disappeared around the curve. Then he walked over to my truck. He looked behind him and handed me a folded sheet of paper. "Keep this." I opened it. Across the top was his handwritten note. "Possible active raptor nest. Recommend wildlife clearance before removal." Directly beneath it were 5 words. "Proceed. OA assumes responsibility." And below those words was Diane Mercer's signature. I read the work order twice before looking back at Carl. "You wrote this?" He nodded. "Yesterday afternoon. I told her office we should stop until somebody cleared the site." I pointed at the signature. "And she signed after that?" 23 minutes later. Carl pulled out his phone. There were 2 calls from Diane's number. One from the property manager, and a message from his supervisor saying the HOA had accepted liability and wanted the work finished before Tuesday afternoon. I didn't ask him to send me anything immediately. I gave him my email address. "Preserve the originals." Then I went inside and built a timeline. No assumptions, no speeches. Dates, times, names, and records. March 6. Diane asked me to remove the trees. March 19th. The HOA sent its first compliance letter. April 2. Diane promised the real estate committee that the view obstruction would be gone before photography day. April 11th, 8:17 a.m. I sent the nesting warning. April 11th, 8:29. Diane replied, "Received." April 15th. Carl documented the nest. April 16th, 7:26 a.m. Diane ordered the crew to continue on camera. Then I added the work order. 1 page, 1 warning, 1 signature. By noon, Carl had emailed me a scanned copy directly from the company system. It matched the paper he handed me. That mattered. Diane could claim she misunderstood an email. She could argue about the property line. She could call my video confrontational. But explaining away a contractor warning sitting directly above her own authorization would be harder. At 12:43, I created a folder labeled Shoreline, Original Files. Then I made the call Diane had been treating like a bluff. By 4:10 that afternoon, she was already changing the story. The HOA sent a message to all 137 homeowners. It said the tree removal had been necessary because of a documented shoreline safety hazard. It also claimed I had interfered with licensed contractors and made unfounded accusations against the board. I printed it. Then I opened the county property records. Diane's argument depended on an easement she claimed gave the HOA access to my shoreline. I pulled the recorded plat, then the deed, then the original utility easement from 1994. The HOA did have access rights, but not where those trees stood. The legal description covered a 12-foot utility strip almost 60 yards north of the cut site. Nothing more. I overlaid the county map with my survey. The result was simple. The crew had been entirely outside the recorded easement. At 5:26, Diane called me. I let it go to voicemail. Her message lasted 47 seconds. She said the association's attorney would address my conduct if I continued spreading false claims. I saved the audio. Then I sent one response. All future communication regarding the tree removal must be in writing. No argument, no threat. At 6:18, I submitted the evidence package. Original photographs, unedited video, county survey, Diane's email acknowledging the warning, Carl's signed work order, and the HOA notice claiming the trees were removed for safety. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:06. The caller identified himself and asked one question. "Mr. Ellison, do you still have the original image files and metadata?" "Yes." "Good. Don't alter anything." That was when I knew someone outside the HOA was finally looking at the timeline. The investigator didn't ask what I thought Diane intended. He asked what I could prove. That was a language I understood. At 10:30, I uploaded the original photographs, the unedited video, the county survey, the email chain, and both versions of Carl's work order. Then he contacted the tree company separately. At 3:17 that afternoon, Carl called me. They asked who authorized the cut. What did you tell them? The truth. He had turned over the dispatch log, Diane's calls, his written warning, and the message from his supervisor confirming that the HOA wanted the work completed despite the nesting concern. Another crew member gave a statement. He confirmed Diane had been present when the final order was given. Now there were 4 independent records tied to the same decision. My email, Carl's warning, the video, and the company log. Diane still thought none of it mattered. That evening, she posted on the HOA community page that I was using baseless federal threats to intimidate the board. I saved the post. Then I saved the follow-up. No protected nest was ever confirmed before removal. I didn't respond. At 7:42 the following morning, Carl sent me 5 words. They asked for everything. Everything. Invoices. Internal messages. Work authorizations. Names of everyone who approved the job. That was the first sign the investigation had moved beyond the stump line. Then a board member I barely knew called me from a private number. His name was Thomas Reed. He didn't ask about the Eagles. He asked whether I had seen the HOA's real estate committee emails. I told him I had seen one. He went quiet. Then said, "You need to see the rest." Thomas sent me 6 emails and 2 meeting attachments. I read them in order. The first came from Diane. The west shoreline obstruction is suppressing premium pricing. The second contained a spreadsheet covering 7 lakefront homes scheduled for new listing photographs. The projected increase associated with improved views ranged from $38,000 to $71,000 per property. Then I found the message that mattered. Diane had written it 9 days before the crew arrived. Tree removal must be completed before photography. Do not delay for non-binding environmental concerns. I read that sentence twice. This was never an emergency. There was no fallen limb, no erosion report, no hazard assessment, no engineer warning. The trees were being removed because Diane wanted cleaner marketing photographs. Thomas explained that he had objected during a board discussion. Diane told him the work qualified as routine vegetation management and didn't require a full vote. He asked whether the land belonged to the HOA. She told him they had sufficient access rights. They didn't. Then Thomas sent me the meeting notes. Beside the shoreline item was one sentence. President authorized expedited removal prior to listing campaign. Now the timeline had something else. A motive. At 9:14 that night, Thomas called again. "Diane knows someone on the board is talking to you." "What is she doing?" "She called an emergency meeting for Thursday. She wants the board to formally accuse you of harassment and demand that you withdraw your complaints." I looked at the calendar. Thursday was 2 days away. "Are residents invited?" "Yes." "Good." Thomas paused. "You're actually coming." I wouldn't miss it, because Diane had already made one mistake after another in private. Now she was about to do it in front of 137 homeowners. Thursday night, the community center was almost full. Diane sat at the center of the board table. The HOA attorney was on her right. Stacks of folders were arranged in front of her. I took a seat in the 3rd row. No speech, no presentation. Just my phone and a copy of the county survey. At 7:06, Diane called the meeting to order. She spent 12 minutes talking about board safety, harassment, and the association's obligation to protect volunteers from intimidation. Then she said my name. "Mr. Ellison has made repeated allegations regarding routine vegetation work performed under association authority. Routine vegetation work. That was how she described cutting trees on land the HOA didn't own after multiple warnings." Diane continued. "The board was never informed of a confirmed protected nest before the work occurred." Thomas looked down at the table. I said nothing. Then Diane held up the same highlighted map she had shown me months earlier. She told the room the HOA possessed legal access to the shoreline. I raised my hand. Eventually, she recognized me. I stood. The recorded easement is 60 yards north of those trees. Her attorney leaned toward her. Diane ignored him. "That is your interpretation." "No, it's the county's legal description." The room got quieter. I asked one more question. "Were the trees removed for safety?" "Yes." "Do you have a hazard assessment?" Diane paused. "No assessment was required." "An arborist report?" "No." "An erosion report?" She stopped answering. Someone near the back asked why the real estate committee had discussed Lakeview pricing. Diane turned toward Thomas. That was when she lost control of the room. She looked back at me. "If you have evidence that this board knowingly did anything improper, produce it." I reached toward my folder. Before I could open it, the doors behind me opened. 2 men stepped inside. Dark field jackets. Identification at chest level. The first looked across the room. "Is Diane Mercer here?" Nobody moved. Then he held up a file. "We need to speak with her regarding the shoreline tree removal." The first investigator walked to the board table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He identified himself as a federal wildlife investigator and placed the file in front of Diane. The second investigator remained near the door. Diane's attorney stood. "My client will not answer questions without counsel." The investigator nodded. "That's her right." Then he opened the file. "We're here to preserve records and clarify who authorized the removal." He removed Carl's work order. Diane stopped moving. He turned the page so the board could see it. At the top was Carl's handwritten warning. "Possible active raptor nest. Recommend wildlife clearance before removal." Below it, "Proceed. HOA assumes responsibility." Then the signature. The investigator looked at Diane. "Ms. Mercer, is this your signature?" Her attorney touched her arm. Diane said nothing. The investigator placed a second document beside it. "My email, April 11th, 8:17 a.m., 6 photographs attached." Then Diane's reply, "Received." A third document followed. The tree company dispatch record, then a transcript from my video. "The HOA assumes responsibility. Keep cutting." Nobody in the room was looking at me anymore. They were looking at Diane. She finally spoke. "We were advised those trees were within an association easement." I slid my survey across the table. The recorded easement is 60 yards north. The investigator already had a copy. "We verified that." Diane changed direction. "The trees were dangerous." Thomas spoke from the board table. "Then why did you tell us they had to be gone before the listing photographs?" Silence. The investigator opened another section of the file. Thomas had apparently provided the same emails he sent me. 7 lakefront properties. Projected increases between $38,000 and $71,000. And Diane's instruction, "Do not delay for non-binding environmental concerns." That was the moment the room changed. Until then, some residents still believed this was a dispute between 2 stubborn property owners. Now they could see the sequence. The removal wasn't responding to an emergency. The warnings hadn't been missed. The property boundary wasn't unclear. Diane had been told, more than once. And she ordered the work anyway. The investigator closed the folder. "We are instructing the association to preserve every email, text message, invoice, work order, meeting note, and electronic record connected to this removal." Diane's attorney asked whether she was being charged. The investigator didn't answer that question. He said, "This investigation is ongoing." Then he looked at the entire board. "Do not delete anything." For the first time since I met her, Diane Mercer had no instruction to give, no clipboard to point at, no rule to quote. Nobody in that room was waiting for her permission, and the federal file wasn't the only problem she had left. The investigation didn't end that night, but Diane's control of the HOA did. By Monday morning, she had stepped down as president pending an internal review. The association froze payments connected to the shoreline project and began turning over records. The tree company provided its original work orders, dispatch logs, and call history. The county confirmed what my survey had shown from the beginning. The trees stood entirely on my property. Over the following months, the HOA dealt with the consequences. Legal expenses, property damage claims, restoration costs, and the wildlife investigation Diane had dismissed as a bluff. The new board didn't try to defend what happened. They changed their procedures instead. No contractor could enter neighboring private property without documented authorization. Environmental concerns could no longer be overridden by a single board officer, and major projects required written verification of the property boundary before work began. Thomas became interim president. His first request to me wasn't about lawyers. It was about trees. The HOA offered to help fund a shoreline restoration plan. I agreed under one condition. The work would be handled by qualified people, not whoever showed up with the cheapest chainsaw. That fall, we replanted the damaged section with native trees and vegetation. The new trees were small. Some barely reached my shoulder. They wouldn't replace what had been lost for decades, but they were growing on the correct side of the property line. The following spring, I was drinking coffee on the porch when a shadow crossed the lake. A bald eagle circled above the shoreline once. Then it disappeared toward the northern ridge. Diane wanted a better view. She got one. She also left behind a county survey, multiple warnings, a contractor's work order, a federal evidence file, and one signature she could never take back. Trees take years to grow back. Trust does too. And neither survives very long when someone mistakes authority for ownership. If you believe property lines still mean something, and that a title, a clipboard, or an HOA badge doesn't make someone the owner, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done at 7:12 that morning when those chainsaws crossed your property line? Because sometimes the most expensive mistake a bully can make is putting the wrong order in writing.